felt heavier than it should have. Margot Whitmore stood before the cabin door, her breath forming small clouds in the December air. 37 years old, and her hands were shaking like a child's, not from the cold that bit through her thin jacket, not from the altitude that made her lungs work harder with each breath, from fear. The sign nailed to the door had faded over the decades, but the words remained legible enough to send a chill down her spine. U.S. property. Restricted area. Sealed 1948. No entry. 76 years. This door had remained closed for 76 years, and beneath that official warning carved into the wood with what must have been a pocket knife, another message waited, one written in her grandfather's hand preserved by the dry mountain air. For family eyes only, when truth matters more than fear. Margot raised the hammer. 3 months ago, she wouldn't have believed any of this was possible. 3 months ago, she was someone else entirely, someone broken, someone invisible, someone with nothing left to lose. The memory surfaced unbidden, pulling her back to that night when everything changed. Rain hammered the back alley behind Eddie's diner like thousands of tiny fists. The kind of rain that found every gap in your clothing, every crack in your defenses, every weakness you thought you'd hidden from the world. Margot pressed herself deeper into the narrow space between the dumpsters, positioning a flattened cardboard box to shield her 3-year-old son from the worst of the downpour. Silas slept somehow, his small body curled against her chest, his breathing occasionally catching with that soft wheeze that never failed to tighten something in her heart. The wheeze was getting worse. She knew that. She'd known it for weeks now, watching each breath with the desperate attention of a mother who had already lost too much. The inhaler was nearly empty and the pharmacy wouldn't refill it without payment. Payment she didn't have. Beside them, 15-year-old Juniper pressed her back against the brick wall. A threadbare blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, her eyes scanning the alley's entrance with the alertness of someone who had learned the hard way that danger could appear from anywhere. Most people called her June. Margot's daughter had always hated her full name, said it sounded like something from a fairy tale, and fairy tales were for people who still believed in happy endings. After 7 months on the street, June had stopped believing in much of anything except the weight of the small knife hidden in her boot. Margot pretended not to know about the knife. Some truths were easier to carry when they remained unspoken. The girl who had once spent hours drawing manga characters and dreaming of art school now spent her nights watching shadows, cataloging threats, learning to read danger in the set of a stranger's shoulders or the rhythm of approaching footsteps. 15 years old, and she moved through the world like a combat veteran, hyper-aware of every exit, every potential weapon, every face that looked too long in their direction. "Mom!" June's voice cut through the sound of the rain. "Someone's coming!" Margot tensed her arms, automatically tightening around Silas. She'd learned to trust her daughter's instincts. At 15, June had developed the survival skills of someone twice her age. She could spot a threat from 50 yards, could read the intentions of strangers in the way they walked, the way they held their hands, the way their eyes moved. The back door of the diner swung open, spilling harsh fluorescent light into the alley. But it was just Marco, the night cook, a heavy-set man in his 40s with kind eyes and grease-stained apron, balancing a paper bag in one hand. "Hey," he said softly, keeping his voice low. "Bunch of fries got burned. Shame to throw them out." He set the bag down within reach, careful not to make Margot feel like a charity case. That small kindness meant more than he could know. "Manager's gone home," Marco added. "You should be good till morning." "Thank you," Margot whispered. Marco nodded once and retreated inside the door, closing behind him with a soft click. In that brief moment of light, Margot had seen him take in the scene. The woman who had once been pretty, now gaunt with exhaustion. The teenage girl with eyes too old for her face. The toddler sleeping against his mother's chest, oblivious to the rain and the cold and the precariousness of his existence. She wondered what Marco saw when he looked at them. She wondered if he saw people or just problems. So many others saw only problems. June reached for the bag, her movements quick and efficient. At least someone in this town has a heart. They'd tried the shelter downtown once. A single night was enough to convince them never to return. The intake workers separated teenage boys from families as a matter of policy. And the woman processing their paperwork had looked at June, tall for her age, with her short hair and oversized hoodie, with narrowed eyes that made something ugly twist in Margot's stomach. Should she be in the men's section? The woman had asked, her voice carrying across the crowded room. June had gone rigid beside her, and Margot had felt her daughter's humiliation like a physical blow. The words had stripped something from June that night, some last remnant of childhood innocence that Margot had been desperately trying to protect. That same night, a man had pounded on their door for hours, shouting for drugs, his fists making the thin wood shake in its frame. Margot had sat with her children in the corner, her hand pressed over Silas's mouth to keep his frightened cries from drawing attention, while June gripped her knife and stared at the door with eyes that no 15-year-old should ever have. The next morning, Margot chose the alley. "At least we're together," she said now, pulling a fry from the bag and breaking it into pieces small enough for Silas to eat when he woke. June's laugh held no humor. "Until CPS decides we'd be better off separated." The words landed like stones in Margot's chest. Child Protective Services. The three letters that haunted her dreams more than the cold, more than the hunger, more than the constant exhaustion that had settled into her bones like a second skeleton. She knew the social workers meant well. She'd met enough of them over the past 7 months to recognize that most genuinely wanted to help. But she'd also seen too many families in their situation torn apart by a system that couldn't understand that sometimes the street was safer than the alternatives. Foster homes with long waiting lists, group facilities where children disappeared into bureaucratic limbo, siblings separated because no single placement could take them all. Margot had met a woman at the community center, a grandmother named Dorothy who had lost her grandchildren to the system. 3 kids split between 3 different counties. The oldest had run away twice. The middle one had stopped talking entirely. The youngest didn't recognize Dorothy anymore when she was finally allowed to visit. "The system isn't designed for families," Dorothy had told her, her voice hollow with grief. "It's designed for cases, for files, for checkboxes. Your children become numbers, and numbers don't have hearts." She would die before she let that happen to her children. By dawn, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Margot hadn't slept. Her back ached from sitting upright against the brick wall, and her joints had stiffened in the cold, making her feel decades older than her 37 years. There was a time not so long ago when she'd complained about minor aches after a long day at work. Now she understood what real pain felt like, the kind that settled into your bones and became part of you. Silas stirred against her chest, blinking up at her with eyes so like his father's that sometimes it physically hurt to meet them. Nate had been gone for 2 years now, killed by a drunk driver who had walked away from the accident with a suspended license and community service. Nate had walked away with nothing, because Nate hadn't walked away at all. "Morning, Bug," she said, summoning a smile from somewhere deep inside herself. The place where mothers keep their reserves for moments exactly like this. Silas smiled back, his small face lighting up despite everything. That was the miracle of children, Margot thought. They could find joy in the smallest things even when the world was crumbling around them. A smile from his mother. A piece of cold French fry. The simple fact of waking up. June was already up repacking their meager belongings into 2 worn backpacks with the efficiency of practice. They had a system now. 7 months of homelessness had taught them how to move through the world like ghosts, taking up as little space as possible, leaving no trace of their presence. Bathroom at the gas station 3 blocks over where the morning attendant looked the other way. Brush teeth, wash, faces change. Silas into a clean shirt if they had one. June would find somewhere to refill their water bottles, while Margot wiped down Silas's hands and face, removing the evidence of their night in the alley. They had learned to be invisible, to slip through the cracks of a society that had no place for them, to exist in the spaces between normal life like shadows that vanished when the light hit them directly. The back door of the diner opened again. This time it was Dave, the manager. A thin man with a receding hairline and an expression that was apologetic but firm. "Margot," he said, and she knew from his tone what was coming before he spoke another word. "I'm sorry, but you can't stay here anymore. The owner drove by last night, saw the setup. He's threatening to call the police." Margot nodded, already reaching for her backpack. "We understand. We'll be gone in 10. "I'm sorry," Dave repeated, and he did look genuinely pained, but not pained enough to risk his job, not pained enough to offer an alternative, not pained enough to see them as anything more than a problem that needed to go away. As Dave disappeared back inside, June muttered under her breath, "We're invisible until someone wants us gone." The bitterness in her voice made her sound decades older than 15. It was a voice that had lost its music, its lightness, its hope. The voice of someone who had learned that the world was not kind, and that expecting kindness only led to disappointment. They gathered their belongings in silence, 2 backpacks containing everything they owned in the world. Margot had sold her wedding ring 4 months ago for a motel room during one of Silas's asthma attacks, when his lips had turned blue and his tiny chest had heaved with the effort of drawing breath. She remembered sitting in that motel room, watching her son sleep peacefully for the first time in days, turning the empty space on her finger where the ring had been. Nate would have understood. Nate would have told her she did the right thing. But Nate wasn't there to tell her anything anymore. The gold locket with Nate's picture had gone a month later, traded for his last prescription. The medication that kept his airways open, kept him breathing, kept him alive. She hadn't even hesitated. What was a piece of jewelry compared to her son's life? All that remained of her former life was a single photograph. The 3 of them, Margot and Nate and June, taken on June's 14th birthday, before the accident, before the medical bills, before everything fell apart. In the photo, they were standing in front of a birthday cake with 14 candles. Nate had his arm around Margot's waist and June was rolling her eyes at something her father had said, but she was smiling, really smiling the way she used to before. She kept it in the inside pocket of her jacket, protected by a plastic bag she'd found behind a convenience store. Some things couldn't be sold, no matter how desperate you became. "Where to?" June asked, shifting Silas onto her hip so Margot could adjust the backpack straps. "Bus station first," Margot decided. "Then we'll figure it out." It was what she always said. "We'll figure it out." As if figuring it out was simply a matter of trying hard enough. As if the solution to homelessness was just around the corner, waiting to be discovered by someone with enough determination. The truth was, she had no idea what came next. Every day was a battle just to survive until the next one. Every decision was a calculation of risk and reward, of calories and shelter, of safety and exposure. There was no long-term plan because there was no guarantee of a long-term. The small town was just waking up as they walked down Main Street. Shop owners unlocking doors, delivery trucks unloading, normal people living normal lives. The world continued all around them while they drifted through it, untethered, unseen. A woman in a business suit hurried past, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, complaining to someone about a meeting that had been rescheduled. A man walked his dog, stopping to let the golden retriever sniff a fire hydrant, completely absorbed in the morning routine that was so ordinary it was invisible to him. These people had homes. They had jobs. They had lives that made sense, that followed predictable patterns, that offered the basic security of knowing where they would sleep tonight. Margot kept her gaze straight ahead, avoiding eye contact. Looking at them felt like pressing on a bruise, a reminder of everything she had lost. "Margot Whitmore, is that you?" The voice came from her left, startling her so badly she nearly tripped over her own feet. A woman stood on the sidewalk outside the pharmacy. Late 60s, with gray hair and a neat bob and bright blue eyes that held a sharpness that age hadn't dimmed. She wore a practical wool coat and sensible shoes, the kind of woman who looked like she'd spent her life getting things done. "Margot," the woman repeated, and there was certainty in her voice now. "Ezekiel Whitmore's granddaughter." Margot blinked, searching the woman's face for something familiar. The name Ezekiel hit her like a wave from the past, bringing with it fragments of memory she had long buried. "I'm sorry, I don't." "Mabel Thornton," the woman supplied. "I lived next door to your grandfather up on Pinewood Ridge. You used to spend summers with him when you were little. You and your sister Laura would catch fireflies in jars while the sun went down." The memory surfaced faintly, like a photograph left too long in the sun. A little girl with braids, a porch swing creaking in the evening breeze, the smell of pine trees and wood smoke. A stern old man with rough hands who had taught her to bait a fishing hook and identify birds by their songs. Grandpa Ezekiel. She hadn't thought about him in years, hadn't been allowed to think about him really. Her mother had cut ties with him when Margot was 9, and the subject had been forbidden ever since. "Mrs. Thornton," Margot said, the name finally clicking into place. It's been a long time." Mabel's gaze traveled over Margot, slowly taking in the worn clothes, the dark circles under her eyes, the careful way she held herself. Then her eyes moved to June's guarded posture and the small boy sleeping on her hip. Something shifted in the older woman's expression. Not pity. Not the uncomfortable look away that Margot had grown accustomed to from strangers. Something more like understanding, like recognition. "I'm in town for a doctor's appointment," Mabel explained. "Just getting my prescription filled. But my goodness, seeing you is..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Have you had breakfast? Let me buy you all some coffee and food." June shot Margot a warning look. They'd learned to be wary of offered help, which too often came with strings attached. A meal in exchange for listening to a sermon, a few dollars with the expectation of something else entirely. Kindness, they had learned, was rarely free. But something about Mabel felt different. Maybe it was the way she looked at them directly without the sliding away gaze of people who wanted to pretend they didn't see. Maybe it was the simple practicality of her offer, no conditions attached, no agenda visible in her weathered face. Or maybe Margot was just too tired to keep her guard up anymore. "That would be... thank you," she said. 20 minutes later, they sat in a corner booth at the Sunrise Cafe across from the pharmacy. The warmth of the restaurant enveloped them like a blanket, and Margot felt her shoulders dropping from their permanent defensive position for the first time in days. Silas had woken fully now and was happily working through a stack of pancake syrup coating his fingers as he attacked the food with the enthusiasm of a child who had learned not to take meals for granted. Each bite was a small miracle to him, each full belly a gift. June maintained her skeptical silence, but she couldn't resist the hot chocolate and breakfast sandwich placed before her. Margot watched her daughter eat, noting how she positioned herself with her back to the wall, how her eyes kept track of everyone who entered the cafe. No child should have to learn that kind of vigilance. Margot wrapped her hands around a steaming mug of coffee, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers like a benediction. Real coffee. Hot coffee. The simple luxury of it almost brought tears to her eyes. "You said you were just between places," Mabel remarked carefully, her own coffee untouched before her. "But that's not quite right, is it?" "We're managing," Margot said automatically. The standard response. The shield she had constructed to deflect the questions of well-meaning strangers and suspicious authorities alike. "Child?" Mabel's voice was gentle but direct. "I've known you since you were knee-high, running through your grandfather's vegetable garden and driving him to distraction. Your mother was pride personified, and I can see you inherited every ounce of it. But sometimes pride isn't worth what it costs." The words hit closer to home than Margot wanted to admit. Pride. Was that what this was? Was she clinging to some stubborn sense of self-sufficiency while her children suffered? Or was it simply that she had learned over 7 brutal months that asking for help often made things worse? "How long has it been like this?" Mabel asked. The question lodged in Margot's throat, too heavy to speak. 7 months, June answered when her mother didn't. Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "Since they repossessed the car." The car. That had been the final blow. They'd been living in it after losing the apartment, parking in different spots each night, trying to stay under the radar. Then one morning they'd woken to find it being towed, and everything inside, their clothes, their documents, their last connections to normal life, had vanished with it. Mabel absorbed this information without judgment. Her blue eyes remained steady, thoughtful. Then she leaned forward slightly, her weathered hands folded on the table. "But that's what I don't understand. No one from the county ever reached you about Ezekiel." The name sent a small shock through Margot's system. "Grandpa Ezekiel, we lost touch when I was 9. He left the mountain. There was some kind of trouble. My mother never talked about it." The memories were fragmented. Raised voices in the kitchen, her mother crying, a phone call that had changed everything. And then silence. Ezekiel had simply ceased to exist in their family, his name never spoken, his photographs removed from the walls. "Oh dear." Mabel set her coffee cup down with a soft clink against the saucer. "He didn't leave the mountain, Margot. He moved from the big house to a smaller place on the same land after the incident, but he never left Pinewood Ridge." "Incident?" June asked, her interest piqued despite herself. Mabel hesitated. "That's a story for another time. The important thing is what happened after." "Is he—" Margot couldn't finish the question. She wasn't sure why it mattered. She hadn't thought about her grandfather in decades. But suddenly, sitting in this warm cafe with the smell of coffee and pancakes, the past seemed closer than it had in years. "No, honey." Mabel's eyes were sad. "Ezekiel passed almost 2 years ago, peacefully in his sleep. But the county's been trying to locate next of kin ever since. They sent letters, posted notices. You're his only living heir." The words didn't make sense. Margot turned them over in her mind, trying to find a shape that fit the reality she knew. Heir to what? June asked, her skepticism clear. A pile of debt. Mabel shook her head firmly. Ezekiel owned his land outright, paid off the mortgage back in 1962, and never owed a dime on it since. There's the main house. It's not in good shape, mind you, been sitting empty since he passed. She paused, reaching into her purse and extracting a folded piece of paper. And there's the cabin, the one that's been sealed since 1948. The word hung in the air between them. Sealed, June repeated. Right after the war ended, Mabel confirmed. Some kind of government operation during the fighting. A listening post, most folks thought. Intercepting radio signals, monitoring enemy communications, that sort of thing. Like spies. June leaned forward despite herself, her teenage cynicism momentarily forgotten. For a moment she looked like the curious child she had been before the streets had hardened her. Something like that. Mabel nodded. Then in late 48, county officials came up with two men in black government sedans. They padlocked the cabin, nailed some kind of official placard to the door, told everyone not to enter for their own safety, said it was a matter of national security. And Grandpa just accepted that, Margot asked. He never broke the seal, Mabel confirmed. At least, not as far as anyone knows. Moved into the main house down the slope. But over the years he grew different, quieter, watchful, especially whenever the war was mentioned, or the company as he called it. What company? That's just it. He never said directly. But Pinewood Ridge was mining country back then. Lots of operations digging for various minerals, especially during wartime. Some folks thought he was referring to one of them. Others thought the war had just affected his mind the way it did so many young men who came home. Mabel tapped the folded paper on the table. I kept this just in case someone ever found you. I had a feeling. Margot took the paper with trembling fingers, unfolding it carefully. It was a property notice, the kind posted by county officials when attempting to locate missing heirs. The language was dry and bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. Property Whitmore family parcel includes primary house condemned and one outbuilding cabin sealed by federal order since 1948. Notices of inheritance have been posted with no response. If no heir claims property by December 31st, ownership reverts to Pinewood County. December 31st. Margot murmured, looking up at Mabel. That's less than a month away. 28 days, Mabel confirmed. The taxes have been paid through the end of the year. Ezekiel was peculiar about some things, but he never missed a tax payment. Said nobody would take his land for back taxes, not after what they'd already tried to take. Margot stared at the paper, her mind struggling to process the sudden shift in her reality. 24 hours ago, she'd been sleeping in an alley, counting the hours until the next meal, wondering if today would be the day CPS finally caught up with them. Now, she was apparently the owner of a mountain property with a condemned house and a mysteriously sealed cabin. I don't understand, she said finally. Even if this is real, what am I supposed to do with a collapsed house and a cabin that's been locked up for 3/4 of a century? Mabel's expression softened. First things first. I have a spare room. It's small, but it's got a bed and a trundle for the children. You all could come back with me to Pinewood Ridge. Stay until you figure things out. She glanced at her watch. The bus leaves at noon. June's eyes widened, her careful neutrality cracking for the first time since they'd sat down. Margot saw something in her daughter's face that she hadn't seen in months. Something that looked dangerously like hope. Why? Margot asked, searching Mabel's face for the catch, the angle, the hidden cost. Why would you help us? Because Ezekiel would have wanted it, Mabel said simply. Because your mother was like family to me once before she moved away and life got complicated. And because... She gestured toward Silas, who was using his last piece of pancake to mop up the remaining syrup. That little boy deserves walls and a warm bed. Simple as that. 3 hours later, Margot found herself on a bus winding into mountains she hadn't seen since childhood. Silas pressed his nose against the window, delighting in the snow-dusted pines that grew thicker as they climbed. His breath fogged the glass, and he used his finger to draw shapes in the condensation. A house, a tree, a stick figure that might have been a person. June sat across the aisle, her expression guarded, but her body language slightly less tense than it had been in months. Even she couldn't completely resist the beauty of the landscape unfolding outside the windows. Mountains rising like ancient sentinels, their peaks lost in clouds. Forests so dense and dark they seemed to hold secrets in their depths. Mabel filled the journey with gentle conversation, piecing together the years that had passed. The cabin was used for some government operation during the war, she explained. Nobody knew exactly what. A listening post monitoring radio signals from overseas. That's what most folks figured anyway. But it stayed sealed after the war ended, June asked. 3 years after. Mabel nodded. 48 was when they came to lock it up. 2 men in suits with official paperwork and a county official along for show. Said it was for safety reasons. Possible contamination from the radio equipment, materials that could be dangerous if handled improperly. And everyone just believed that it was a different time, honey. People trusted the government more back then, or at least they knew better than to ask too many questions. Mabel's expression grew distant. My father used to say the mountains keep their secrets well. You have to earn their trust before they'll show you the truth. Your father, Margot said carefully, remembering something Mabel had mentioned earlier. You said he knew Grandpa Ezekiel. Best friend since boyhood. Mabel's voice caught slightly. They grew up on neighboring farms, joined up together when the war started, came home together when it ended, or at least Ezekiel came home. My father... She trailed off, staring out the window at the passing trees. He disappeared in 48, same year they sealed the cabin. The official story was that he'd gone to find work in the city. Jobs were scarce in the mountains back then, but my mother never believed it. Said he wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. Wouldn't have left at all, not with her expecting their second child. What do you think happened to him? Mabel was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I think he knew something he shouldn't have. Something about what really happened in that cabin, or in those mines, or both. And I think that knowing cost him everything. The bus crested a final hill, and Pinewood Ridge came into view below them. A small town nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forest and dramatic mountain peaks that rose like sentinels against the winter sky. Welcome home, Mabel said softly. Mabel's house was exactly what Margot would have expected. Small but immaculately kept with hand-stitched quilts on every bed, the scent of something savory simmering on the stove, and bookshelves lining every available wall. That first night, Margot stood in the doorway of the spare room, watching her children sleep in real beds for the first time in 7 months. June had curled up on the trundle, her guard finally lowered in unconsciousness. For once, she looked her age, 15, just a child despite everything she'd been forced to become. Silas lay in the center of the larger bed, his small body making barely a dent in the mattress. His breathing was easy tonight, none of the wheezing that kept Margot awake with worry so many nights. She allowed herself a moment of cautious hope. Then she closed the door softly and went to find Mabel. The older woman was in the kitchen washing the dinner dishes by hand in the old farmhouse sink. "Tomorrow," Margot said, "I need to go to the county office, figure out what's really involved in this inheritance." "I figured you would." Mabel handed her a dish towel. "The probate office opens at 9. I can drive you." "The roads up to your grandfather's place can be tricky this time of year, especially if you don't know them." "I want to see the cabin," Margot said. "Whatever's in there, whatever Grandpa was keeping sealed, I need to know." Mabel nodded slowly. "I understand. But Margot, I should warn you, there are people in this town who've wanted to get their hands on that property for a long time. People with money and influence and no particular concern for what's right." "What kind of people?" "Mining interests mostly. A company called Ridgeline Resources has been buying up land all over the county for the past decade. They say they're doing environmental surveys studying the geology, but nobody ever sees any actual scientists, just men in expensive suits making offers that are hard to refuse. They've approached Grandpa's property before. Multiple times, according to what I heard. Your grandfather always refused. Told them where they could stick their offers, if you'll pardon my language." A small smile crossed Mabel's face. Ezekiel could be stubborn as a mountain goat when he wanted to be. Said nobody would ever take his land while he was breathing. And now that he's not, Mabel's expression grew serious. "Now that he's not, I expect they'll try again. With you. They have a way of making their offers sound reasonable, helpful even. But underneath all the polish." She shook her head. "Just be careful, Margot. That's all I'm saying. Your grandfather had reasons for keeping that cabin sealed. Maybe good ones. Maybe not. But finding out the truth might attract attention you're not prepared for." Margot thought about the alley behind Eddie's diner. The way she'd learned to make herself small and invisible. The way she'd taught her daughter to do the same. "I've been invisible for 7 months," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time to be seen." The county probate office was a small brick building on Main Street, wedged between a hardware store and a coffee shop. Inside, a tired-looking clerk with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses sat behind a counter piled high with folders. His eyes widened when Margot presented her ID and explained who she was. "Whitmore," he repeated as if he couldn't quite believe it. "Ezekiel Whitmore's granddaughter. Well, I'll be damned." He disappeared into a back room, returning moments later with a thick file labeled with Margot's name in faded typewriter font. "We've been trying to find you for almost 2 years," he said, setting the file on the counter between them. "Where have you been?" "Not receiving mail," Margot said simply. The clerk studied her for a moment, something like understanding flickering across his face. Then he shook his head and opened the file. "Well, timing's tight, but you're still within the claim period. Got a pen? There's a stack of papers for you to sign." Margot's hand trembled slightly as she worked through the documents. Each signature felt like a step into unknown territory, each stroke of the pen binding her more tightly to a past she barely remembered and a future she couldn't imagine. With the final signature, she became the official owner of the Whitmore property, a collapsing main house, and the legendary sealed cabin on the ridge. "Now there are some conditions," the clerk added, shuffling through additional paperwork. "The main house was condemned 10 years ago. Unsafe structure. You can't live in it without significant repairs and reinspection by county officials." Margot nodded. She had expected that. "And the cabin," the clerk continued, "remains under the original sealing order unless officially released by the Department of Defense." "Department of Defense," June echoed. She'd insisted on coming along, Silas staying with Mabel at the house. Wartime operations. The clerk shrugged. Above my pay grade, young lady. All I know is what the paperwork says. That cabin was sealed in 1948 by federal authority, and it stays sealed unless they say otherwise. Margot thought about that faded sign, the one that had somehow survived 76 winters on the mountain. U.S. property. Restricted area. Sealed 1948. No entry. What happens if someone does enter? She asked. The clerk looked uncomfortable. Technically, violation of a federal order could mean fines, even criminal charges, but between you and me, he lowered his voice. That order's older than I am. Half the people who signed it are probably dead by now. I doubt anyone in Washington even remembers it exists. He slid her copies of all the documents she'd signed. The property's yours now, Miss Whitmore. What you do with it is your business. Just be careful up there. Old buildings, old mines, mountain properties can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. On a sudden, Margot gathered the papers, tucking them carefully into her bag. I'll be careful, she said. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Careful was what she'd been for 7 months, and it had gotten her nowhere. Careful was sleeping in alleys and hiding from social workers and watching her children grow harder with each passing day. Maybe it was time to stop being careful. Maybe it was time to start being brave. They were walking toward Mabel's truck in the courthouse parking lot when a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb beside them. The window slid down and a man's face appeared. 50s silver hair, expensive parka that looked out of place among the town's more practical winter wear. His smile was the kind that never quite reached his eyes. Miss Whitmore. Margot stopped, instinctively positioning herself between the stranger and June. I don't believe we've met. Harlan Briggs. The man extended his hand through the open window. When Margot didn't take it, he withdrew it smoothly, as if the rejection was expected. Head of Regional Operations for Ridgeline Resources. Word travels fast in small towns. I understand you've just claimed your grandfather's property. News to me that it would interest a mining company. We've had interest in parcels near your grandfather's land for years. Natural Resources don't observe property lines after all. He gestured toward a coffee shop across the street. Perhaps we could discuss some mutually beneficial arrangements. Ridgeline would be happy to help with taxes, repairs. We've just signed the papers, Margot said, her voice flat. I haven't even seen the property yet. Of course. Harlan nodded, his expression sympathetic. But the main house is essentially a teardown at this point, condemned for nearly a decade. And that old cabin, his voice shifted slightly, probably unsafe, possibly contaminated from whatever military operations went on there back in the day. Asbestos, lead paint, who knows what else. Contaminated, Margot repeated. It's a real concern with properties from that era, especially ones that were used for specialized purposes. Harlan's eyes flicked to June, who was watching him with undisguised hostility. You have children, I see. Little ones. You'd want to keep them safe from any hazardous materials. Something cold settled in Margot's stomach. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Briggs. I'm just trying to help. His smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect. I could have you sign a quick cash sale today, enough to get you into a nice apartment in the city somewhere safe for the little ones. New start. No hassle with repairs or inspections or legal complications. He named a figure that made Margot's breath catch. It was more money than she'd seen in years. More than the hospital bills that had bankrupted them. More than enough to rent an apartment, buy a reliable car, put food on the table for months. 7 months ago, she would have jumped at it. 7 months ago, she was a different person. I appreciate the offer, Margot said, and she was surprised to hear how steady her voice sounded. But I think we'll explore the property first, get our bearings before making any decisions. Something flickered in Harlan's eyes, something that looked almost like frustration quickly masked by that practiced smile. Of course, smart to do your homework. He reached into his jacket pocket and extracted a business card, holding it out through the window. My offer stands, Miss Whitmore, when you're ready. Margot took the card more to end the conversation than out of any intention to call. Harlan's window began to rise, but he paused halfway. Though I should mention property values and options do change. Market conditions, regulatory complications. I wouldn't wait too long to decide. He gave her one last smile. Welcome to Pinewood Ridge. The window closed and the SUV pulled away, its tires crunching on the gravel. June stepped up beside her mother, watching the vehicle disappear around the corner. I don't like him, she said flatly. That makes two of us, Mabel agreed, appearing behind them. She'd been waiting by the truck close enough to hear the entire exchange. Ridgeline has been buying up property all over the county for years. They say they're doing surveys, environmental studies, but nobody ever sees any results, just men in suits making offers. He mentioned contamination, Margot said. If there's something dangerous on the property. That's their favorite tactic, Mabel snorted. Scare you into selling cheap. Your grandfather got the same pitch years ago. Said the government operations left behind toxins, hazardous materials, all sorts of frightening sounding things. Ezekiel told them where they could stick their concerns. But what if it's true? June pressed. Mabel's expression grew thoughtful. The only thing contaminating that cabin is the truth. That's what Ezekiel always used to say. Truth is the most dangerous toxin to power. Made no sense to most folks. But your grandfather wasn't the type to speak in riddles without reason. The road to the Whitmore property wound higher into the mountains through stands of pine trees heavy with snow. Margot sat in the passenger seat of Mabel's truck, watching the landscape transform as they climbed. The trees grew denser, the air thinner, the silence deeper. It was like traveling back in time, away from the modern world and into something older, wilder, less certain. It was late afternoon by the time Mabel turned onto a narrow drive marked only by a weathered wooden sign. Whitmore Ridge, private property. The main house came into view first, and Margot's heart sank. Whatever she'd imagined, this was worse. The roof had partially caved in on one side, exposing rotted beams to the winter sky. The porch sagged dangerously toward the ground, its railings missing or broken. Windows were shattered dark openings into an interior that looked more like a cave than a home. Raccoon tracks were visible in the snow around the foundation, along with other markings Margot couldn't identify. It wasn't this bad when Ezekiel was alive, Mabel said quietly. He kept it up as best he could even after he got too old to climb the roof for repairs. But after he passed, well, vacant houses don't last long in mountain winters. But Margot's eyes had already moved past the ruined house. Up the slope, half hidden among fir trees, a small structure sat silhouetted against the darkening sky. The cabin. Something about it made her breath catch. Something that felt almost like recognition, though she had no memory of ever seeing it before. Can we get up there? She asked. There's a path, Mabel confirmed. But it'll be getting dark soon. We should probably wait until... But Margot was already opening the truck door. I want to see it before dark. The path was treacherous, narrow and icy in patches with exposed roots hidden beneath the snow, waiting to catch unwary feet. Silas rode on Margot's hip, his small arms locked around her neck. He'd been quiet during the drive, watching the unfamiliar landscape with wide eyes, but now he pressed his face against her shoulder, as if trying to hide from the looming trees. June followed close behind, her city sneakers ill-suited for the terrain, but her determination unwavering. She had her phone out, recording everything despite the dying light. The cabin was smaller than Margot had imagined, a squat, sturdy building with a pitched roof and logs darkened by decades of weather. Heavy rusted padlock and chains secured the door, looking almost welded in place by time and corrosion. Wood planks had been nailed across the windows, some beginning to rot at the edges but still firmly in place. The building had an air of intentional closure, not abandoned but sealed, deliberately shut away from the world. And centered on the doorframe, barely visible in the fading light, the sign. U.S. property, restricted area, sealed 1948, no entry. Beneath it, etched into the wood with what must have been a pocket knife, her grandfather's message. For family eyes only, when truth matters more than fear. June raised her phone, capturing the image. "What do you think is inside?" she asked. Margot stared at the cabin, at the padlock, at the words her grandfather had carved, knowing that someday someone would read them. "I don't know," she admitted, "but he left it for us to find." "We should head back," Mabel called from the edge of the clearing. "I cleaned up a room in the main house that's still stable. Patched the roof myself last summer just in case someone came looking for it. We can sleep there tonight, safer than trying to go back down the mountain in the dark." That night they huddled around a space heater in the one stable room of the old house. Mabel had brought supplies: canned soup warmed on a camping stove, crackers and cheese, hot chocolate made with water heated over a camp flame. It was a far cry from the breakfast at the Sunrise Cafe that morning, but Margot felt warmer than she had in months. June sat with her back against the wall, her phone charging from a portable battery Mabel had brought. She was reviewing the footage she'd taken of the cabin, pausing on the image of her grandfather's carved message. "For family eyes only," she read aloud. "When truth matters more than fear." "He knew," Margot said quietly. "Whatever's in there, he knew someday one of us would come looking." "But why keep it sealed for so long?" June asked. "If there's something important in there, why not just tell someone?" Mabel was quiet for a moment, her weathered hands wrapped around her cup of cocoa. "Fear is a powerful thing, child. It can make strong men do weak things, keep quiet when they should speak, look away when they should see." She gazed toward the window, toward the dark shape of the ridge above them. "Your grandfather lived with fear for a long time. Maybe he thought keeping the truth sealed was protecting his family. Maybe by the time he realized it wasn't, it was too late." Silas had fallen asleep in the corner, bundled in blankets, his breathing soft and even. Margot watched her son's chest rise and fall, thinking about fear. About all the things she'd done out of fear over the past 7 months. The hiding, the running, the making herself small and invisible. She thought about the man in the black SUV, his too white smile, and his talk of contamination and quick cash sales. She thought about her grandfather living alone on this mountain for decades, guarding a secret he could never share. That night, as she drifted toward sleep on the old mattress Mabel had dragged into the stable room, Margot dreamed. She dreamed of her grandfather, younger than she'd ever known him, standing between dark pines with snow falling all around him. He was speaking, his lips moving, and somehow through the decades and the distance, she heard his voice clearly. "I tried to protect you by keeping it closed. Maybe I was wrong. The truth is dangerous, but silence is worse. Silence lets the wrong people win." She woke before dawn, her mind clear and certain. "We're going to open it," she announced. June looked up from her phone where she'd been unable to sleep. "The cabin." "Yes." "But the federal order. What about—" "That order is 76 years old. Whatever they were protecting then, whatever they were afraid of, it's been buried long enough." Margot sat up, pushing the blankets aside. "This is our land now, our family's history. Whatever Grandpa was keeping sealed, it's time to find out." Mabel appeared in the doorway, already dressed for the cold. "I had a feeling you'd say that," she said. "I brought something that might help." She held out an old metal toolbox, rust-spotted but solid. "These were his, Ezekiel's. I've kept them since he passed. Didn't feel right throwing them away." Margot took the toolbox, running her fingers over the worn metal. Inside were basic tools, a hammer, screwdrivers, pliers, all well used but meticulously maintained. Another tangible connection to the grandfather who was becoming more real to her with each passing hour. They made their way back up the ridge as the morning sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. The air was bitterly cold but clear, their breath visible in small clouds as they climbed. At the cabin door, Margot studied the rusted padlock and chain. "Mom, wait." June had her phone out again. "I want to record this, just in case." "In case of what?" "In case someone tries to say we never found anything or tries to take it away." Her daughter's eyes were hard with a wisdom no 15-year-old should have. "Documentation matters. Evidence matters. We learned that the hard way." Margot nodded slowly. 7 months of homelessness had taught them both that the world rarely played fair, especially with those who had no power. June positioned herself to capture both her mother and the cabin door. "Okay," she said. "Ready." Margot positioned the hammer against the ancient padlock. The first strike reverberated through the clearing, startling a pair of crows from a nearby branch. The second strike dented the metal. The third sent rust flaking away in brown-red chips. She fell into a rhythm, each blow driving away another piece of the barrier that had stood for 76 years. By the fifth strike, the padlock was showing serious wear, the metal beginning to distort under the repeated impacts. And finally, with one powerful blow, the lock shattered with a crack that echoed through the trees like a gunshot. The chain fell away, clattering against the wooden porch. Margot stood there for a moment, breathing hard, the hammer hanging at her side. The door was still closed, but the barrier was gone. She reached for the handle, finding it stiff but functional. The wood had swollen in its frame, requiring her to put her shoulder against it and push. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protest that seemed to come from the cabin itself, the door gave way. The first breath of air from inside was dry, heavy with dust, and tinged with something metallic. Old paper, old machines, old secrets. Margot stepped inside, and 76 years of silence finally came to an end. The cabin interior was frozen in time. Dust motes swirled in the morning light that slanted through the open door. Everything was exactly as it had been left, preserved by the cold, dry air and the darkness that had protected it for so long. A narrow cot stood against one wall, its wool army blanket folded with military precision. A bulky shortwave radio sat on a desk, its microphone still angled toward a chair, as if its operator had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. Stacks of yellowed papers were arranged in neat piles, their edges slightly curled but otherwise intact. Maps covered one wall, large tactical maps with colored pins marking routes across the Pacific and Europe. "It really was a listening post," June whispered, stepping in behind her mother. Margot moved deeper into the cabin, drawn by something she couldn't name. A metal filing cabinet stood in the corner, its drawers labeled in faded typewriter font. transcripts, intercept logs, field reports. But it was the desk that captured her attention. There, centered precisely as if waiting for this exact moment, sat a small wooden box. Her breath caught as she saw her own name written on its surface in shaky handwriting she somehow recognized from the message carved on the door. For Margot, when you have nothing left to lose. Her hands trembled as she lifted the box. It wasn't locked. The simple brass clasp opened easily under her fingers. Inside lay 3 items. An old war bond certificate, yellowed but still intact, the denominations far larger than she would have expected. A small brass key with a tag attached reading, "Main House, Secret Room, Behind Pantry," and a sealed envelope thick with folded pages. Margot carefully extracted the letter, breaking the seal with gentle fingers. Her grandfather's handwriting filled the pages, cramped and urgent, as if he'd been racing to get the words down before something stopped him. My dear Margot, if you're reading this, I've passed on and you've found your way back to Whitmore Ridge. I hope it wasn't desperation that brought you here, but I've prepared for that possibility nonetheless. The war bond is worth considerably more now than when it was issued. It should help with immediate needs. The key opens a room few know exists behind the pantry in the main house. There's a panel that slides to reveal a door. But the true inheritance is what surrounds you in this cabin. During the war, this place served as a listening post. We monitored radio traffic, not just foreign signals, but communications between certain American companies and government officials. Companies like Piedmont Mining, now operating under the name Ridgeline Resources. By 1947, I had evidence they were using the war as cover for illegal operations, valuable ore extraction without permits, land grabs from families while young men were overseas fighting, and worst of all, forced labor. They called them work camps for essential wartime production, but they were prisons. Local men, especially from the native communities and poor mountain families, disappeared into these camps. Many never returned. I started copying records, intercepting logbooks, hiding them here. When they realized what I was doing, I was warned. Seal it, forget it, or your family disappears. So I sealed the cabin under official order. But I refused to destroy the truth. I thought I was protecting our family by keeping silent all these years. Now, at the end of my life, I wonder if silence was just another form of cowardice. One day, someone in our bloodline would need this more than I needed my fear. That someone is you, Margot. With love and regret, your grandfather Ezekiel Whitmore. Margot lowered the letter, her vision blurring with tears. Behind her, Silas had wandered to the old radio, his small fingers curiously turning one of the knobs. To everyone's shock, the long-dead machine crackled to life. A brief burst of static, then a fragment of what must have been a recorded broadcast, still somehow trapped within its mechanisms. The war in Europe is over, a tiny voice proclaimed before cutting out again. June gasped. It still works. How is that even possible after all this time? But Margot barely registered the miracle of the ancient radio. Her mind was racing, connecting pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed until this moment. Piedmont Mining, Ridgeline Resources, forced labor camps, disappeared workers, and her grandfather caught in the middle, forced to choose between truth and survival. Mom, June's voice cut through her thoughts. Her daughter was pointing at the filing cabinet. Should we look? Margot nodded slowly. The drawers were stiff with age and disuse, requiring both of them to pull together. But eventually they yielded revealing folders meticulously organized by date and subject. intercepted telegrams about mineral shipments deliberately mislabeled as scrap, handwritten logs of train car numbers, routes and dates, and lists of names, men and boys transferred to temporary labor sites for essential war needs, many with no record of return. "These aren't just military records," Margot murmured, flipping through page after page. "This is evidence. Evidence that Ridgeline's predecessors built their empire on exploitation." She looked up at her daughter, at Mabel standing in the doorway, at the small boy who had wandered back to her side. "They stole resources. They stole land." Her voice caught. "They stole people." The sun was setting by the time they made their way back down to the main house, arms full of documents Margot couldn't bear to leave behind. That night, sitting in the stable room by the light of camping lanterns, they began to sort through what they'd found. Page after page of evidence that spanned decades, photographs of work camps that looked more like prisons, death certificates with causes listed as industrial accident in suspiciously similar handwriting, and maps detailed geological surveys with areas marked in red, including one labeled in her grandfather's hand, "Whitmore Ridge, Unauthorized Shaft, 1947. They were mining under our land, Margot realized, without permission, without anyone knowing. "And when people found out," June said slowly, "they disappeared." Mabel had been quiet for a long time, studying a list of names with trembling hands. "Harold Thornton," she read aloud, her voice breaking. "Site 7, transferred March 1948. No further record." She looked up, tears streaming down her weathered face. "My father, he didn't leave us, he was taken." The room fell silent, except for the wind moaning through the broken boards of the old house. Outside in the darkness, the distant growl of engines broke the mountain silence. Margot moved to the window, peering through a crack in the boards. Down at the base of the property, where the private road met the county highway, headlights were gathering. Two large pickup trucks with the Ridgeline Resources logo visible on their doors, their engines idling in the cold. Men emerged, silhouettes against the glare of headlights. One raised binoculars, pointing not at the house but at the ridge above, at the cabin. "They know," June whispered, appearing at her mother's shoulder. "They know we opened it." Margot watched the trucks, the men the binoculars tracking across the mountain slope. Harlan Briggs had offered her money that morning. Money and warnings about contamination and helpful suggestions about selling quickly. Now his people were here watching, waiting to see what she would do next. Margot thought about her grandfather, living under the weight of this secret for decades. The fear that had kept him silent. The courage it must have taken to preserve the evidence anyway, trusting that someday someone would be strong enough to use it. She thought about her children sleeping fitfully in the corner. The future they deserved, the truth they needed to understand. 7 months ago she had nothing, no home, no money, no power. Now she had something far more dangerous. She had the truth, and she was done being afraid. Morning came gray and cold, the mountains shrouded in low clouds that clung to the peaks like secrets refusing to be told. Margot hadn't slept. She'd spent the night reading through her grandfather's files by lantern light, each page revealing another layer of the horror that had been buried beneath these mountains for nearly 8 decades. Names, dates, locations, men who had kissed their wives goodbye and never returned, sons who had promised their mothers they'd be home by Christmas, fathers who had left for what they thought were legitimate jobs and vanished into the earth itself. The lists went on for pages, hundreds of names, each one representing a family shattered, a life stolen, a truth buried along with the bodies. And at the center of it all, like a spider in a web of corporate deceit, the company that had changed its name but never its nature. Piedmont Mining, now called Ridgeline Resources, still operating in these mountains, still buying up land, still according to what she'd found working to bury any evidence of what they'd done. The knock on the door came just after 9. Margot was already awake, already dressed, already expecting trouble. She'd watched the Ridgeline trucks depart sometime before dawn, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they retreated down the mountain road. But she knew they'd be back. Men like Harlan Briggs didn't give up easily. "Stay here," she told June, who had fallen into a fitful sleep near Silas. "Keep your phone ready." She opened the door to find Harlan standing on the sagging porch, his expensive parka looking even more out of place against the backdrop of the ruined house. 2 men in Ridgeline jackets flanked him, their expressions carefully neutral. "Miss Whitmore." Harlan's smile was as practiced as ever, but there was something different in his eyes this morning. Something that looked almost like respect. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "What do you want, Mr. Briggs?" "Direct. I appreciate that." He glanced past her into the dim interior of the stable room. "May I come in? What I have to say might be better discussed in private." Margot considered refusing, but she also knew that understanding your enemy required letting them speak. "5 minutes," she said, stepping aside. Harlan entered, his bodyguards remaining outside. His gaze traveled over the camping stove, the sleeping children, the stacks of yellow documents spread across every available surface. If he recognized what those documents were, he gave no sign. "You've been busy," he observed. "I've been learning about my family history." "History?" Harlan nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss." He reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope, thick and official-looking. "I've spoken with my superiors. Given the unique circumstances of your situation, Ridgeline is prepared to significantly improve our offer." He named a figure that made Margot's breath catch. It was more than double what he'd offered yesterday. Enough to buy a house outright. Enough to set up college funds for both children. Enough to never worry about rent or food or medical bills again. 7 months of sleeping in alleys. 7 months of hiding from social workers. 7 months of watching her daughter become something hard and sharp just to survive. And here was a man offering to make all of that disappear. "That's very generous," Margot said carefully. "It reflects our genuine desire to help you and your family move forward." Harlan's voice was smooth as oil. "A fresh start. A real home. Stability for your children." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Of course, in exchange, we would need full rights to the property and its contents. Everything on this land would become Ridgeline property, including any historical materials that might have been stored here." There it was. Not the land, not the mineral rights, the documents, the evidence, the truth. "You want to bury it," Margot said quietly. "Whatever my grandfather found, whatever he documented, you want to make sure it never sees daylight." Harlan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "I want to protect you, Miss Whitmore. Old documents, old accusations, these things can be misinterpreted, taken out of context, used to create problems where none need to exist." "Problems for whom?" "For everyone." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You have children. A 3-year-old with health issues from what I understand. A teenage daughter who's been through more than any young person should have to endure." The mention of her children sent ice through Margot's veins. "Are you threatening my family?" I'm offering you a way out. Harlan's smile never wavered. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention certain realities. You're living in a condemned structure. Your children are being exposed to potentially hazardous materials from decades-old government operations. Any reasonable person might question whether this is an appropriate environment for young people. He let that hang in the air. CPS asks a lot of questions in situations like this. Questions about stability, about judgment, about whether a parent is truly acting in their children's best interests. The threat was unmistakable now. Take the money and walk away or watch your family be torn apart. Margot thought about the alley behind Eddie's diner. The way June had learned to sleep with one eye open. The way Silas's small body would shake during his worst asthma attacks, his lips turning blue while she prayed for morning. She thought about the names in her grandfather's files. Harold Thornton, and hundreds of others. Men who had families too, children who grew up without fathers, wives who spent their lives waiting for husbands who would never return. You have 48 hours, Harlan said, extending the envelope toward her. Think about your children, Miss Whitmore. Think about what's really best for them. Margot didn't take the envelope. I'll think about it, she said. Harlan set the envelope on the nearest surface, his smile widening slightly. I'm sure you'll make the right decision. He turned and walked out, his bodyguards falling into step behind him. Margot stood in the doorway watching until the black SUV disappeared down the mountain road. Then she picked up the envelope, walked to the camping stove, and held it over the flame until the paper caught fire. Mom, June's voice came from behind her. What are you doing? Margot watched the envelope burn, the ashes falling into the cold morning air. Making a decision, she turned to face her daughter. Get dressed. We have work to do. The key from her grandfather's box was small and brass, tarnished with age, but still solid in her palm. Main house, secret room, behind pantry. The pantry in the main house was little more than a closet, now its shelves broken and water damaged from years of neglect. But when Margot ran her fingers along the back panel, she felt what she was looking for. A seam. Invisible to the eye but detectable to touch. Here, she murmured. June held the lantern higher while Margot worked her fingers into the gap. The panel resisted at first, swollen with moisture and age, but finally it gave way with a reluctant groan. Behind it was a small door no more than 4 feet high with an antique keyhole that matched the key in her hand. Margot inserted the key. It turned with a click that seemed to echo through the empty house. The door swung inward, revealing darkness beyond. June aimed her phone's flashlight into the opening, illuminating a space that had been sealed even longer than the cabin. Unlike the cabin, which had been frozen in time but relatively orderly, this room felt desperate, urgent, as if whoever had filled it had been working against a deadline they feared they might not meet. Papers were stacked in towering piles against every wall. Photographs pinned to a corkboard connected by strings in patterns that suggested obsessive analysis. File boxes labeled with dates and locations, their contents bulging against the cardboard. And on a small desk in the center of it all, a single notebook, its leather cover cracked with age. Margot picked it up and began to read. Her grandfather's handwriting filled every page, the script growing more cramped and urgent as the entries progressed. March 1947, confirmed existence of unauthorized shaft beneath Whitmore property. Piedmont Mining operating without permits, without oversight, without any official record. April 1947. Intercepted communication between site foreman and Piedmont executives discussing labor acquisition, reference to collection points in 4 counties. Men being taken from their homes, their families told they've left for work elsewhere. May 1947, personal observation of conditions at Site 4. Workers living in underground barracks, no sanitation, no medical care, guards armed with rifles. This is not a labor camp, this is a prison. The entries continued, each one more damning than the last. Margot turned page after page, her hands trembling as the full scope of what her grandfather had discovered became clear. Forced labor on a scale she hadn't imagined possible. Men worked to death in dangerous conditions, their bodies disposed of in the very mines they'd been forced to dig. Families destroyed, communities hollowed out, entire generations of mountain people exploited and discarded. And behind it all, the company that would become Ridgeline Resources, protected by officials who looked the other way, by lawyers who buried evidence, by a system that valued profit over human life. Then she found the entry that changed everything. June 1946, I have become what I despised. The words were written in a shaking hand, the ink smeared in places as if by tears. They made me an overseer, said it was promotion, said it was recognition of my skills. I was proud, God help me, proud to be trusted. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what the job really meant. The first time I saw a man beaten for working too slowly, I told myself it was an isolated incident. The first time I heard screams from the lower shafts, I told myself there must be an explanation. The first time they asked me to sign a death certificate listing industrial accident for a man I'd seen murdered, I knew the truth. And I signed it anyway. I signed it because I was afraid. Because they told me what would happen to my family if I didn't cooperate. Because I was a coward who valued my own comfort over another man's life. I have become the monster I should have fought. Margot's vision blurred with tears. Her grandfather, the man she'd idolized in her childhood memories, the stern but loving presence who had taught her to fish in mountain streams and identify birds by their songs. He had been part of it, not a victim, a participant, a man who had signed death certificates for murdered workers, who had looked the other way while human beings were worked to death in underground prisons. Mom. June's voice was tentative. What is it? Margot couldn't speak. She simply handed her daughter the notebook, watching as June's expression shifted from curiosity to horror to something that looked almost like grief. He was one of them, June whispered. Yes. But then, June flipped forward through the pages. He changed. Look, the entries after this one. He started documenting everything, copying records, building evidence. Margot took the notebook back, reading the later entries. September 1946. I have begun keeping duplicate records of every death, every transfer, every suspicious order. If I cannot undo what I have done, perhaps I can ensure that someday the truth will be known. December 1946. They suspect something. I've been reassigned to the listening post away from direct operations. They say it's because of my radio skills, but I know the truth. They're watching me now, waiting to see if I'll stay silent. March 1948. The men in black suits came today. Federal officials, they said. National security concerns. They've ordered the cabin sealed, all equipment left in place. But they didn't find this room. They didn't find the evidence I've hidden here. The truth will survive me. It has to. Margot closed the notebook. Her grandfather had been a monster. And then he had tried to become something else. He had failed to stop the crimes while they were happening. But he had preserved the evidence at tremendous personal risk, knowing that someday someone might use it to bring justice. Was that redemption? Could anything redeem a man who had signed death certificates for murdered workers? She didn't know. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The truth her grandfather had preserved at whatever cost to his own soul deserved to be told. And she was going to tell it. The Pinewood Ridge Library was a small stone building on the edge of town, its architecture dating back to the early 20th century. Inside, the smell of old books and wood polish filled the air, and dust motes danced in the light streaming through tall windows. Ruth Pendleton looked up from the reference desk as Margot entered. She was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. Her eyes were sharp behind those glasses, missing nothing. "Can I help you?" "I hope so." Margot approached the desk, her heart pounding. "My name is Margot Whitmore. Ezekiel Whitmore was my grandfather." Ruth's expression shifted instantly. "Ezekiel, good Lord." She removed her glasses, studying Margot with new interest. "He used to come in here, you know, years ago, asking for old newspapers, mining records, anything related to the war years. Most folks thought he was just a troubled veteran with too much time on his hands." "He wasn't troubled," Margot said. "He was documenting." She reached into her bag and withdrew a folder of documents, setting them on the desk between them. "I found these in his cabin and in a hidden room in the main house. I think you should see them." Ruth's hands trembled as she examined the papers. "The Blackwater mine collapse," she whispered, her finger tracing a line on one of the documents. 1946. "Everyone was told it was structural failure. 27 men died. My Uncle Joseph was one of them." She looked up at Margot, tears gathering in her eyes. "We never even got his body back. They said the shaft was too unstable to recover the remains. But this," she tapped the document, "this shows they knew the support beams were compromised weeks before they sent men down. They knew, and they sent them anyway." "There's more," Margot said quietly. "Much more." By the end of the day, Margot had made 2 more allies. Wallace Drummond was a retired history teacher in his 60s, with a gray beard and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the look of an absent-minded professor. But his mind was anything but absent. For the past decade, he'd been running a blog documenting suspicious activities by Ridgeline Resources and its predecessor companies. "I've been tracking them for years," he explained, spreading his own research across his kitchen table. "Land acquisitions that don't make economic sense, environmental surveys that never produce reports, patterns that suggest they're buying up properties to control what's found on them, not to develop them." "They're burying evidence," Margot said. "Literally and figuratively." "That's what I've always suspected, but I never had proof." Wallace's eyes were bright with excitement as he examined her grandfather's documents. "This changes everything. These aren't suspicions or theories. These are primary sources, contemporary records of exactly what they did." Through Wallace, Margot connected with Adelaide Crane. The lawyer was in her 40s, with sharp features and an even sharper mind. She'd built her career fighting corporate malfeasance, and she'd crossed paths with Ridgeline before. "They buried me," Adelaide admitted, her voice tight with old frustration. "I represented a family whose property had been contaminated by mining runoff. We had evidence, witnesses, expert testimony, but Ridgeline's legal team is like a wood chipper. They filed motion after motion, delayed proceedings for years, drove up costs until my clients couldn't afford to continue." "What if you had evidence they couldn't dispute?" Margot asked. "Original documents from the crimes themselves, maps, memos, death certificates, everything preserved for 76 years. Adelaide's expression transformed. "Show me." That evening, they gathered at Wallace's cabin on the outskirts of town. Margot June, Mabel Ruth Wallace, and Adelaide, an unlikely alliance united by a common cause. The documents were spread across every surface, maps marked with the locations of unauthorized mining operations, lists of workers who had been transferred to labor sites and never returned, internal memos discussing how to handle the disappearance problem, and the most damning evidence of all, a page with names circled in red, family names that still carried weight in Pinewood Ridge: Hollis, Cartwright, Peterson. The founding families of Piedmont Mining, the same families that still controlled Ridgeline Resources. This is unprecedented, Adelaide said, her legal mind already working through the implications. Evidence preserved from the original crimes connecting the historical company directly to modern Ridgeline through continuous family ownership. Can we stop them? June asked. Can we actually win? We can fight them. And with this evidence, we might actually have a chance. Adelaide outlined a strategy, her voice growing more confident as she spoke. First, we digitize everything. Multiple copies, multiple locations, cloud storage, physical backups, copies sent to trusted third parties. Already started, Wallace confirmed. I've been scanning documents all afternoon. Good. Next, we file a formal claim documenting illegal use of Whitmore land, historical human rights violations, and fraud by Ridgeline's predecessor companies. We notify state and federal investigators through trusted channels. She paused, her expression growing serious. Most importantly, we secure the original documents. Harlan's deadline is tomorrow, and I wouldn't put it past them to try something desperate. Margot thought about the men in Ridgeline trucks watching the property from the road below. They're already watching, she said. They know we found something. They just don't know how much. Then we need to move the originals somewhere safe, somewhere they won't think to look. The decision was made quickly. The original documents would be divided among multiple locations. Some would stay with Adelaide, protected by attorney-client privilege. Others would go to Wallace's cabin, which had a safe room built into the basement. The most sensitive materials would be mailed overnight to Adelaide's journalist contact in the state capital. By midnight, everything had been photographed, scanned, and distributed. Margot stood on Wallace's porch watching the stars wheel overhead, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of someone drowning, the quiet, steady hope of someone who had finally found solid ground. Mom. June appeared beside her, 2 cups of hot chocolate in her hands. You should try to sleep. Margot accepted the cup, wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. I've been thinking about Grandpa, she said. About what he did. What he was part of. June was quiet for a moment. He made terrible choices, she said finally. He helped them. He signed those death certificates. Yes. But then he tried to make it right. He preserved the evidence. He kept it safe for decades, waiting for someone who could use it. Margot nodded slowly. Does that make him a good person? June asked. Can someone who did terrible things ever really be redeemed? It was a question Margot had been wrestling with all day. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe redemption isn't about becoming good after being bad. Maybe it's about choosing every day to do better than you did before. Maybe it's about making sure your mistakes don't become someone else's burden. She turned to look at her daughter, this fierce young woman who had grown up too fast in too hard a world. He couldn't undo what he did, but he gave us the tools to finish what he started. That has to count for something. June considered this. I think, she said slowly, that the best thing we can do for him is make sure his truth gets told. All of it, the good parts and the bad parts. Let people decide for themselves what kind of man he was. Margot felt tears prick her eyes. When had her 15-year-old daughter become so wise? "When did you grow up so much?" she asked. June's smile was sad and knowing. "Somewhere between the shelter and the alley, I think." Margot pulled her daughter close, holding her tight against the cold mountain night. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything you've had to go through." "Don't be," June's voice was muffled against her shoulder. "We're still together. That's what matters. And now—" She pulled back, her eyes bright in the starlight. "Now we're going to make them pay for what they did. All those families who never got answers, all those people who disappeared, we're going to tell their story." Margot looked at her daughter, seeing not the frightened child who had huddled in alleys, but the strong young woman she was becoming. "Yes," she said, "we are." The attack came 3 nights later. Margot had moved her family back to Mabel's house, where there were proper beds and running water and the comfort of walls that didn't let in the wind. They'd been careful, varying their routines, never leaving documents unattended, always keeping phones charged and ready. But Ridgeline had resources they couldn't match. The power went out at 2 in the morning. Margot was awake instantly, 7 months of street survival having trained her body to respond to any change in her environment. She reached for June, finding her daughter already alert beside her. "Stay with Silas," Margot whispered. "Don't make a sound." She crept to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. 2 figures moved across Mabel's yard, their shapes barely visible in the darkness. They weren't trying to hide. They moved with the confidence of men who expected no resistance. One of them carried something that glinted in the faint starlight. Bolt cutters. They were heading for the shed where Mabel kept her tools and garden supplies. The shed where until 2 days ago they had been storing copies of the documents. Margot felt a grim satisfaction wash over her. The documents weren't there anymore. She'd moved them to Wallace's cabin, following Adelaide's advice to keep the evidence mobile, unpredictable. But the intruders didn't know that. She watched as they broke into the shed, heard them ransacking the interior, searching for papers that were miles away. 15 minutes later, they emerged empty-handed. Even from a distance, Margot could see their frustration in the way they moved, sharp and angry. One of them pulled out a phone, the screen's glow illuminating his face for just a moment. Margot didn't recognize him, but she recognized the Ridgeline logo on his jacket. They retreated into the darkness, and a few minutes later she heard engines starting somewhere down the road. When the power came back on, an hour later, Mabel was already in the kitchen, her expression grim. "They cut the line to the main junction," she said. "Probably thought it would give them more time to search. They didn't find anything." "No, but they'll be back." Mabel set a cup of coffee in front of Margot. "And next time they might not be so gentle." The CPS visit came 2 days later. Margot was at Wallace's cabin reviewing documents with Adelaide when her phone rang. June's number. "Mom." Her daughter's voice was tight with controlled fear. "There are people here. They say they're from Child Protective Services. They want to talk to you about our living situation." Margot's blood ran cold. "I'm on my way. Don't let them in until I get there." She made the 20-minute drive in 12, her heart pounding the entire way. 2 CPS workers were standing on Mabel's porch when she arrived. A man and a woman, both in their 30s, both carrying clipboards and wearing expressions of professional concern. "Mrs. Whitmore," the woman stepped forward. "I'm Sarah Bennett, and this is my colleague David Morrison. We've received a report about your children's living situation. We'd like to ask you some questions." Margot forced herself to remain calm. "Of course. May I ask who filed the report?" "Reports are confidential," the man David said. but we're required to investigate any concerns about child welfare. I understand. Please come in. They walked through Mabel's house, their eyes taking in every detail. The clean kitchen, the warm living room, the children's belongings neatly organized in the spare bedroom. We were told you've been living in a condemned building, Sarah said, consulting her clipboard. That your children have been exposed to hazardous materials and unsanitary conditions. We spent a few nights at my family's property while assessing its condition. Margot replied, her voice steady. The main house is indeed condemned, which is why we didn't stay there. We've been living here with Mrs. Thornton while we determine what repairs are needed. And the children's father, deceased 2 years ago. Sarah made a note. We were also told you've been homeless for an extended period, living on the streets with your children. Margot felt the old shame rising, the instinct to hide, to make herself small and invisible. But she was done hiding. Yes, she said. We were homeless for 7 months. After my husband's death, medical bills and other debts consumed everything we had. We lost our home, our car, eventually, our ability to maintain a stable address. She met Sarah's eyes directly. During that time, I kept my children fed, clothed, and together. I protected them from the dangers of street life. I made sure my daughter continued her education, and my son received his medical treatments. It wasn't the life I wanted for them, but I never stopped being their mother. David was writing rapidly on his clipboard. And now, Sarah asked, now I've inherited property from my grandfather. We're working with a lawyer to assess its value and determine our next steps. In the meantime, we have a safe, stable place to stay with Mrs. Thornton, who has known my family for decades. I can vouch for that, Mabel interjected from the doorway. Margot and her children have been staying with me for over a week. They're well cared for, well fed, and well supervised. Whatever anonymous report you received was malicious nonsense designed to cause trouble. Sarah and David exchanged glances. We'll need to speak with the children separately, David said. Margot's instinct was to refuse, to put herself between her children and any potential threat, but she knew how that would look, knew it would only make things worse. Of course, she said, but I'd like to be present during any conversation with my 3-year-old. He has medical issues and can become anxious with strangers. The interviews were brief. June answered questions with the same steady composure she'd developed on the streets, describing their living situation accurately without volunteering unnecessary details. Silas, sitting on Margot's lap, talked happily about the pancakes Mabel made and the birds he could see from the bedroom window. When it was over, Sarah closed her notebook with a snap. Based on our assessment, we don't see any immediate safety concerns. The home is adequate, the children appear healthy and well cared for, and there's no evidence of the conditions described in the report. Margot let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. However, David added, we will be making follow-up visits to ensure the situation remains stable. And if any additional concerns arise, you'll be the first to know, Margot finished. I have nothing to hide. After they left, she stood on Mabel's porch watching their car disappear down the road. Harlan Briggs had made his move. An anonymous report designed to trigger an investigation to put pressure on her, to remind her that he had the power to disrupt her life in ways she couldn't control. But it hadn't worked. Not this time. She pulled out her phone and called Adelaide. They sent CPS, she said. It didn't work, but they're getting desperate. Good, Adelaide replied. Desperate people make mistakes. I've got news too. I found a way to get this before a judge. There's a state law about preservation of historical evidence that might apply, and I've got a journalist friend who's very interested in the story. When? 2 weeks, maybe sooner if I can push the paperwork through. 2 weeks. Margot looked toward the mountains, toward the ridge where her grandfather's secrets had waited for 3/4 of a century. "Make it sooner," she said. "I don't think they're going to wait." She was right. 3 nights later, driving back from a meeting with Adelaide in the neighboring town, Margot noticed headlights in her rear-view mirror. At first, she thought nothing of it. The mountain roads were narrow but not deserted. Other people had business that took them out after dark, but the headlights stayed behind her, mile after mile, matching her speed, maintaining the same distance. She accelerated slightly. The headlights accelerated too. Her heart began to pound. The road curved ahead, winding around the shoulder of the mountain. On one side, a steep drop into darkness. On the other, a wall of rock. She was alone. No cell signal this far from town. No witnesses. The vehicle behind her surged forward. The impact came without warning, a hard strike to her rear bumper that sent her car fishtailing across the icy road. Margot gripped the wheel, fighting for control. Her tires found purchase on dry pavement and she straightened out. The headlights came again. Another impact, harder this time. Her car slewed toward the edge of the road, toward the darkness beyond. She could feel the wheels losing traction, could hear the gravel spraying from beneath her tires. Terror clawed at her throat. But somewhere beneath the fear, something else emerged. Something cold and hard and determined. 7 months of survival had taught her many things. How to find food when there was none. How to stay warm when the cold wanted to kill her. How to protect her children when the world wanted to tear them apart. And how to keep going when everything inside her screamed to give up. She pressed the accelerator to the floor. Her car leaped forward, putting distance between herself and her pursuer. The road straightened ahead, and she could see lights in the distance. The gas station at the edge of town. Cameras, witnesses. Behind her, the pursuing vehicle hesitated. She kept her foot on the gas, watching in her rear-view mirror as the headlights fell back, then turned off onto a side road and disappeared. When she reached the gas station, she pulled in and sat with her hands shaking on the wheel for a long time. Then she called Adelaide. "They tried to run me off the road." "Are you hurt?" "No, I made it to town. They backed off when they saw the lights." Silence on the other end. Then Adelaide's voice, harder than Margot had ever heard it. "That's it. I'm filing for an emergency hearing. We're not waiting 2 weeks. We're going to court now." Margot thought about the darkness beyond the road's edge, the headlights bearing down on her, the moment when she'd felt the car begin to slide toward the drop. "Good," she said. "It's time to finish this." The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Adelaide worked around the clock, filing motions, preparing arguments, contacting witnesses. Wallace coordinated with his journalist contacts, ensuring that whatever happened in the courtroom would be covered by media beyond Ridgeline's influence. Margot met with family after family who had lost loved ones in the mountain mines, elderly women who had spent their lives wondering what happened to their fathers, middle-aged men carrying photographs of grandfathers they'd never known. Each one had a story. Each one had questions that had never been answered. Ruth Pendleton introduced her to Mrs. Beckett, the town's oldest resident at 93. Her uncle had been one of the 27 who died in the Blackwater collapse. "My father used to say his brother was more than just missing," Mrs. Beckett said, her voice quavering but clear. "He said Joseph was taken. Nobody believed him, said he was crazy with grief, but he never stopped believing, never stopped hoping someone would find the truth." She reached out and took Margot's hand in her own, her grip surprisingly strong. "You're doing what nobody else could do, child. You're speaking for the ones who can't speak for themselves anymore." Margot looked into those ancient eyes, seeing decades of waiting, Decades of hoping, decades of being told that the truth didn't matter, that the past should stay buried. "I promise," she said. "I'll tell their story, all of it." The night before the hearing, Margot sat with her children in Mabel's spare room. Silas was already asleep, his breathing easy and regular. His health had improved in the weeks since they'd come to the mountains. The clean air, the regular meals, the stability that Margot had thought they might never find again. June sat cross-legged on the trundle bed, her phone in her hands, reviewing the footage she'd taken since they arrived. "I've got everything documented," she said. "Every document we found, every person we talked to, every threat Ridgeline made. If something happens tomorrow..." "Nothing's going to happen," Margot said, but her voice lacked conviction. June looked up, her eyes too old for her 15 years. "You don't know that. Harlan Briggs tried to run you off the road. He sent CPS to take us away. He had people break into Mabel's house." She paused. "He's not going to stop just because we're going to court." Margot sat down beside her daughter. "You're right," she admitted. "I don't know what's going to happen, but I know that we've come too far to back down now. Those families deserve answers. Those men who died deserve to be remembered. And your great-grandfather," she hesitated, "he deserves to have his truth told, all of it." June was quiet for a moment, including the bad parts that he worked for them before he turned against them. Including the bad parts. Margot reached out and took her daughter's hand. "We don't get to choose which truths matter. If we only tell the parts that make us look good, we're no better than the people who buried the evidence in the first place." June nodded slowly. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said quietly. "I know I don't say it enough, but I am. You could have taken the money. You could have walked away, but you didn't." Margot felt tears prick her eyes. "I thought about it," she admitted. "When Harlan offered that money, I thought about how easy it would be to take it and run, to give you and Silas the life you deserve." "We have the life we deserve," June said. "We're together, we're safe, and we're doing something that matters." She smiled, and for a moment she looked like the carefree child she'd been before everything fell apart. "Besides, you taught me that some things are worth more than money. I guess I finally understand what you meant." Margot pulled her daughter into a hug, holding her close. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "I want you to know that you're the bravest person I've ever known." "I learned from the best," June replied. They sat together in the darkness, mother and daughter, waiting for dawn and whatever it would bring. The Pinewood Ridge County Courthouse was an imposing structure of granite and limestone built in the 1920s, when men still believed that justice was something solid, something that could be carved in stone and trusted to endure. Its marble steps had been worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Farmers seeking property settlements, families disputing wills, criminals facing judgment. And now, on this cold December morning, something the old building had never seen before. A reckoning, 76 years in the making. Margot stood at the base of those steps, looking up at the carved words above the entrance. "Equal justice under law." The letters were weathered, but still legible, a promise made by men long dead to generations they would never know. She wondered if they had meant it. She wondered if it had ever been true. Around her, the crowd continued to gather. It had started as a trickle, a few elderly residents who remembered the old stories, who had grown up with whispered questions about fathers and uncles and brothers who had simply disappeared. But word had spread. Through the network of families Adelaide had contacted, through Wallace's blog and his journalist connections, through the simple, unstoppable power of a story that had been waiting decades to be told. Now there were dozens of people on the courthouse steps. Old women clutching photographs of men they had never known. Middle-aged sons and daughters who had grown up with holes in their family histories. Reporters with cameras and microphones drawn by the promise of a story that went deeper than anyone had imagined. And at the center of it all, Margot Whitmore, a woman who had been sleeping in alleys 3 months ago. A woman who had nothing left to lose. A woman who had found something worth fighting for. Miss Whitmore, a reporter pushed forward, microphone extended. Can you tell us what you hope to achieve today? Margot looked at the faces surrounding her. The hope, the grief, the decades of unanswered questions. The truth, she said simply. That's all any of us want. The truth about what happened to our families, the truth about who was responsible, and the truth about why it was buried for so long. She turned and began climbing the steps, Adelaide at her side, the crowd parting to let them through. At the top she paused and looked back one more time. Somewhere in that crowd she knew June was watching. Her daughter had insisted on being here, had argued that she was old enough to witness history being made. Margot had finally agreed, leaving Silas with Mabel's neighbor, but allowing June to join the gallery. Her daughter stood near the back of the crowd, phone in hand, documenting everything. Their eyes met. June nodded once. Margot nodded back. Then she turned and walked into the courthouse. The courtroom was already crowded when she entered. Ridgeline Resources had arrived in force. A team of attorneys in suits that probably cost more than Margot had earned in her best year. PR representatives distributing glossy fact sheets about the company's commitment to community development and environmental responsibility. And at the center of it all, Harlan Briggs, his silver hair perfectly styled his expression, one of calm confidence. He caught Margot's eye as she made her way to the plaintiff's table. His smile was the same as always, practiced, professional, predatory. But there was something different in his eyes today. Something that looked almost like respect. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition of a worthy opponent. Judge Eleanor Blackwood entered precisely at 9 o'clock. She was in her 60s with steel gray hair and a reputation for fairness that had survived 3 decades on the bench. She had seen everything they said. Nothing surprised her anymore. Margot hoped that wasn't entirely true. This hearing, Judge Blackwood began, her voice carrying easily through the packed courtroom, has been convened to consider evidence presented by the plaintiff regarding historical crimes allegedly committed by predecessor companies of the defendant, and to determine whether sufficient cause exists for a formal investigation. She looked over her glasses at both tables. I will hear arguments from both sides. I will examine the evidence presented, and I will make a determination based solely on the facts and the law. Her gaze settled on the Ridgeline attorneys. Mr. Prescott, you may begin. William Prescott rose from the defense table. He was in his 50s with the kind of distinguished gray temples that came from expensive barbers rather than honest age. His voice was smooth, his manner confident. Your Honor, we move to dismiss this entire proceeding as a publicity stunt based on misinterpreted historical fragments. He gestured toward the gallery where reporters were already taking notes. The plaintiff has produced a collection of old papers, the authenticity of which cannot be verified. She claims these documents prove crimes committed nearly 80 years ago, yet she cannot produce a single living witness to corroborate her allegations. Prescott paused, letting that sink in. Furthermore, even if these documents were genuine, the statute of limitations on any criminal activity has long since expired. The individuals allegedly responsible are deceased. The company that may or may not have been involved no longer exists. He turned toward Margot, his expression one of practiced sympathy. We understand that the plaintiff has experienced significant hardship. We sympathize with her desire to find meaning in her family history, but this courtroom is not the place for historical grievances or conspiracy theories. Judge Blackwood's expression remained neutral. Thank you, Mr. Prescott. Miss Crane, your response. Adelaide rose, her manner calm, but her eyes sharp. Your Honor, I appreciate Mr. Prescott's concern for the plaintiff's welfare, but his arguments mischaracterize both the evidence and the purpose of these proceedings. She picked up a folder from the table before her. We are not here to prosecute individuals who are long deceased. We are here to establish the historical record, to preserve evidence of crimes that were deliberately buried, and to determine whether the modern corporation that inherited the assets and the leadership of those responsible has continued a pattern of suppression and concealment. Adelaide opened the folder. Regarding authenticity, we have submitted expert testimony from Dr. Harold Fleming, a document analyst with 30 years of experience. He has examined the paper composition, ink formulation, and typewriter fonts used in these documents. His conclusion, and I quote, is that these materials are consistent with documents produced in the 1940s and show no signs of subsequent alteration or forgery. She turned a page. We have also submitted geological surveys conducted by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, confirming the existence of previously unknown mining shafts beneath the Whitmore property, precisely where the historical documents indicate unauthorized operations took place. Another page. And we have statements from 14 families in this county, all of whom lost relatives under suspicious circumstances during the period in question. Relatives who were recorded as having left for work elsewhere but were never seen again. Relatives whose names appear on lists found in the sealed cabin on Whitmore Ridge. Adelaide looked directly at Judge Blackwood. The plaintiff is not seeking to prosecute the dead. She is seeking to give voice to the voiceless, to shine light on crimes that have been hidden in darkness for far too long, and to ensure that the corporation which benefited from those crimes cannot continue to bury the truth. The judge nodded slowly. Thank you, Miss Crane. I will hear the evidence. The first 2 hours of testimony established the foundation. Dr. Fleming walked the court through his analysis of the documents, explaining in detail how he had determined their age and authenticity. He was followed by Dr. Mitchell, whose geological surveys proved beyond doubt that mining operations had taken place beneath the Whitmore property operations that had never been permitted or recorded. Then came the families. Ruth Pendleton testified about her uncle Joseph, who had died in the Blackwater collapse of 1946. Her voice shook as she described how the family had been told his body couldn't be recovered, how they had never received any compensation, how questions about the cause of the collapse had been brushed aside by company lawyers. The documents found in the Whitmore cabin, she said, show that Piedmont Mining knew about structural problems in that shaft weeks before the collapse. They knew, and they sent men down anyway. My uncle died because his life was worth less to them than the cost of proper safety measures. Other families followed, each one with a story, each one with a name on the lists, each one with questions that had never been answered. And then Mabel Thornton took the stand. She had aged in the weeks since Margot had first met her outside the pharmacy. The strain of what they had discovered of confronting the truth about her father's disappearance had etched new lines into her weathered face. But her voice was steady as she told her story. My father was Harold Thornton. He was 29 years old in 1948 with a wife and 2 children. One of those children was me. She paused, composing herself. One morning he kissed my mother goodbye and said he was going to see about work at the mill. That was the last time anyone in our family ever saw him. The courtroom was silent. My mother was told he'd gone to the city, looking for better opportunities. She didn't believe it. She knew my father would never have left without saying goodbye, without making sure she and the children would be provided for. Mabel's eyes found Margot in the gallery. She waited for him her entire life. Raised us alone, never remarried, never stopped believing he would come home. She turned back to the judge. When I saw my father's name on that list on the records from Site 7, I finally understood. He didn't abandon us. He was taken, used, and when he was no longer useful, he was disposed of. Her voice broke. For 76 years, my family lived with the shame of believing we had been abandoned. For 76 years, the truth was hidden in a sealed cabin on a mountain ridge. My father deserves better than that. All of those men deserve better than that. Judge Blackwood's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in her eyes. Thank you, Mrs. Thornton. You may step down. The afternoon session began with Ridgeline's counterattack. Prescott called his own experts who raised questions about the chain of custody of the documents. He produced records showing that Ezekiel Whitmore had been treated for what was then called combat fatigue after returning from the war, implying that his mental state made him an unreliable source. We are not questioning the grief of these families, Prescott said smoothly. We are simply pointing out that the foundation of this entire case rests on materials collected by a single individual working alone with no oversight or verification. An individual who, by all accounts, grew increasingly isolated and paranoid in his later years. Adelaide objected. Judge Blackwood overruled. The momentum was shifting. Margot could feel it in the restless movement of the gallery and the satisfied smirks of the Ridgeline attorneys and the careful neutrality of the judge's expression. They needed something more. They needed the truth about Ezekiel. All of it. And then Prescott delivered the blow they had been waiting for. Your Honor, we wish to introduce into evidence a document that we believe is highly relevant to this proceeding. He produced a single page, holding it up for the court to see. This is a personnel record from Piedmont Mining dated 1946. It identifies Ezekiel Whitmore as a site overseer for one of the company's mining operations. The murmur that swept through the courtroom was like a physical wave. Prescott's smile widened. The plaintiff's star witness, the man whose documents form the basis of this entire case, was not some innocent observer documenting crimes from the outside. He was an employee of the very company he later accused, a participant in the very operations he claimed were criminal. He turned toward the gallery, his voice rising. This isn't a case of a brave whistleblower exposing corporate malfeasance. This is a case of a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge for perceived slights. A man who was part of the system and later turned against it, possibly to cover his own complicity. Prescott faced Judge Blackwood. We submit that this revelation fundamentally undermines the credibility of all evidence derived from Ezekiel Whitmore's collection. If he was willing to participate in these alleged crimes, how can we trust his account of them? If he had personal grievances against the company, how can we know his documentation wasn't selective, manipulated, or outright fabricated? The courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Family members looked at each other in confusion. The Ridgeline attorneys sat back with expressions of satisfied triumph. Judge Blackwood banged her gavel. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. The noise subsided slowly. Miss Crane, do you wish to respond? Adelaide rose, but before she could speak, Margot was on her feet. Your Honor, I would like to testify. Adelaide's hand caught her arm. Margot, we discussed this. Let me handle... No. Margot's voice was quiet but firm. This is my family's story, my grandfather's truth. I need to be the one to tell it." Adelaide hesitated. Then she nodded. "Your Honor, the plaintiff wishes to take the stand." The walk from her seat to the witness stand felt like the longest of Margot's life. She could feel every eye in the courtroom on her. The families who had trusted her to speak for their lost loved ones, the reporters who would broadcast her words to the world, the Ridgeline attorneys who expected her to crumble under the weight of her grandfather's sins, and somewhere in the gallery her daughter watching, documenting, believing in her. Margot took the oath and sat down. Adelaide approached the stand. "Miss Whitmore, you've heard the defense's claims about your grandfather's involvement with Piedmont mining. How do you respond?" Margot took a deep breath. "When I found that document in my grandfather's hidden room, showing that he had been a site overseer, I felt betrayed. The man I had idolized in my childhood memories, the stern but loving grandfather who had taught me to fish and identify birds by their songs, had been part of something terrible." Her voice caught, but she pushed on. "I wanted to hide it, to pretend I hadn't found it, to tell the story of a hero instead of the truth about a complicated, flawed human being." She looked directly at Judge Blackwood. "But that's exactly what the people who buried this evidence wanted. They wanted the truth to stay hidden because they knew that complicated truths are harder to defend than simple ones. They knew that if people learned my grandfather had been part of the system before he turned against it, some would use that to dismiss everything he documented." Margot turned toward the gallery, toward the families who were watching her with uncertainty in their eyes. "My grandfather made terrible choices. He signed death certificates for men he knew had been murdered. He looked the other way while human beings were worked to death in underground prisons. For that, he can never be forgiven." She paused, letting the words settle. But then something changed in him. I found a journal entry where he wrote, "I have become what I despised." And from that moment on, he began to document everything. He copied records, intercepted communications, preserved evidence that he knew might someday be used to expose the truth. Margot reached into her jacket and withdrew a folded paper. "This is a memo from Piedmont Mining, dated September 1946. It reads, 'Whitmore refusing to participate in disposal. Recommend removal from operation and reassignment to listening post.'" She held it up for the court to see. "My grandfather was transferred away from the mining operations because he refused to help cover up murders. He was sent to the listening post where they could watch him, where they thought he would be isolated and harmless. They didn't know he would spend the next 2 years secretly documenting everything they did." Margot set the paper down. "The defense wants you to believe that my grandfather's involvement makes his evidence unreliable. I would argue the opposite. Because he was inside the system, he knew exactly what was happening. Because he participated before he resisted, he had access to information that no outside observer could have obtained." Her voice grew stronger. "Was my grandfather a hero? No. He was a man who made terrible choices and spent the rest of his life trying to make amends. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he could preserve the truth at tremendous personal risk, knowing that someday someone might use it to bring justice." Margot looked at the Ridgeline attorneys at Harlan Briggs with his practiced smile at the corporate power that had kept this secret buried for nearly 8 decades. "I'm not here to tell you that my grandfather was a saint. I'm here to tell you that he eventually found the courage to do the right thing even when it was dangerous, even when it was too late to save the men who had already died. And I am here to finish what he started." She turned back to Judge Blackwood. "The evidence speaks for itself. The documents are authentic. The mining shafts exist. The men disappeared. Those are facts that don't change regardless of who collected them." My grandfather's complicity doesn't make the truth any less true. If anything, it makes it more damning because it proves that people inside the company knew exactly what was happening and chose to stay silent. Margot sat back. I'm not asking for forgiveness for my grandfather. I'm not asking you to call him a hero. I am only asking you to look at the evidence he preserved and judge it on its merits. The families in this courtroom deserve that. The men who died in those mines deserve that. And the truth, however complicated, deserves to be heard. The courtroom was silent. Judge Blackwood studied Margot for a long moment. Then she turned to Prescott. Your witness. The cross-examination was brutal, but brief. Prescott tried to shake Margot's account to find inconsistencies, to suggest that she had been manipulated by lawyers seeking a payday. But Margot held firm, answering each question directly, refusing to be rattled. When it was over, Judge Blackwood called a recess until the following morning. That night, Margot sat with Adelaide and Wallace at the small kitchen table in Mabel's house, reviewing the day's events. It could go either way, Adelaide admitted. Your testimony was powerful, but Prescott made some effective points about credibility. The judge is going to weigh the evidence carefully. Is there anything else we can do? June asked. She'd been quiet since returning from the courthouse, processing everything she had witnessed. Wallace shook his head. We've presented everything we have. Now it's up to Judge Blackwood. The knock on the door came just after 9. Everyone tensed. After the break-in, after the car chase, after the CPS visit, unexpected visitors had become something to fear. Margot approached the door carefully. Who is it? My name is Robert Harmon. The voice was male, middle-aged, nervous. I used to work for Ridgeline. I saw you on the news today. I have something you need to see. Margot exchanged glances with Adelaide. Then she opened the door. Robert Harmon was in his 50s with thinning hair and the rumpled appearance of a man who hadn't slept well in a long time. His hands were shaking as he clutched a laptop bag to his chest. May I come in? They led him to the kitchen table where he sat heavily as if his legs couldn't support him anymore. I worked in Ridgeline's records department for 12 years. He began without preamble. My job was to process documents related to property acquisitions, land surveys, geological reports, historical assessments. He opened his laptop bag and withdrew an external hard drive. About 5 years ago, I started noticing a pattern. Whenever we acquired a property that had any connection to the old Piedmont mining operations, I would receive instructions to flag certain documents for special handling. These documents would be removed from the regular archives and transferred to a separate storage facility. What kind of documents? Adelaide asked. Historical records, old personnel files, anything that mentioned specific mining sites or worker transfers during the 1940s. Harmon's voice dropped. I was told it was for archival purposes, preservation of company history. But I started to notice that the documents that went into that special storage never came back out. He plugged the hard drive into his laptop. A few months ago, I made copies of the transfer orders, the communications about special handling, the internal emails discussing what they called the Whitmore problem. He turned the screen toward them. Harlan Briggs has been personally directing a campaign to acquire any property that might contain evidence of Piedmont's wartime activities. And every time evidence is found, it disappears. Margot stared at the emails on the screen. Whitmore property presents significant exposure risk. Recommend aggressive acquisition strategy. If acquisition fails, implement alternative containment measures. Another email dated just 3 weeks ago. Whitmore granddaughter has accessed sealed cabin, situation critical. Authorized to proceed with full pressure protocol. Full pressure protocol, Margot repeated. Is that what they call threatening to take my children, running me off the road in the middle of the night? Harmon nodded miserably. I didn't know about those things specifically, but I knew something was wrong. I've known for years. He trailed off. I was afraid. I have a family, a mortgage. I told myself it was just old history, that it didn't matter anymore. He looked up at Margot. Then I watched you testify today. I saw you stand up there and tell the truth about your grandfather, the good and the bad, and I realized that if you could do that, I had no excuse for staying silent. Adelaide was already reaching for her phone. Mr. Harmon, would you be willing to testify tomorrow? That's why I'm here, Batten. He reached into the laptop bag again and withdrew 2 more drives. These aren't the only copies. If something happens to me, others will come forward. I've made sure of it. The second day of the hearing began with a bombshell. Adelaide requested permission to present additional witnesses. Judge Blackwood, after reviewing the nature of the testimony, agreed over Prescott's strenuous objections. Robert Harmon took the stand first. His testimony was devastating. He walked the court through years of document destruction, explaining in detail how Ridgeline had systematically sought out and eliminated evidence of Piedmont's crimes. He produced emails showing Harlan Briggs's direct involvement in what they called historical management. But he wasn't alone. 2 other former Ridgeline employees had come forward overnight, emboldened by Harmon's decision. They corroborated his account, adding details about specific properties where evidence had been found and destroyed, about families who had been paid off and silenced, about a corporate culture that valued secrecy above all else. One of them, a woman named Patricia Caldwell, who had worked in legal compliance, dropped the biggest revelation of all. There's a storage facility in Helena, she testified. It's where the collected documents were supposed to be archived. But about 3 years ago, I was asked to certify that certain materials had been properly disposed of. What materials? Adelaide asked. Original records from the 1940s, personnel files, medical reports, geological surveys. Patricia's voice was steady. I refused to sign the certification because I had never seen the actual disposal. I was terminated 2 weeks later. The courtroom erupted. Judge Blackwood banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order. At the defense table, Harlan Briggs's face had gone pale. His attorneys were conferring frantically, their earlier confidence shattered. When order was finally restored, Judge Blackwood turned to Prescott. Does the defense wish to cross-examine? Prescott rose slowly. Your Honor, we request a brief recess to confer with our client. Denied. You may cross-examine or decline. The cross-examination was perfunctory. Whatever strategy Ridgeline had planned, the parade of whistleblowers had demolished it. The closing arguments were brief. Adelaide summarized the evidence. The authentic documents from Ezekiel Whitmore's collection, the geological surveys confirming unauthorized mining, the testimony of 14 families who had lost loved ones, and now the confirmation from inside Ridgeline that the company had been actively working to destroy evidence and silence anyone who asked questions. This is not a case of historical grievances being dredged up for profit, she concluded. This is a case of ongoing corporate misconduct. Ridgeline Resources has spent decades covering up the crimes of its predecessor companies, not because those crimes don't matter, but because they matter too much. Because the truth about what Piedmont Mining did would destroy the foundation on which Ridgeline was built. She turned toward the families in the gallery. These people have waited 76 years for answers. Their fathers and uncles and brothers deserve to be remembered. Their families deserve to know the truth, and this court has the power to ensure that the truth is finally told. Prescott's closing argument was defensive, emphasizing that no criminal charges could be filed for events that occurred nearly 80 years ago, that most of the evidence was circumstantial, that the company should not be held responsible for the alleged actions of predecessor organizations. It fell flat. Everyone in the courtroom could see it. Judge Blackwood listened to both arguments with her usual impassive expression. Then she shuffled her papers and looked out at the crowded gallery. "I have heard compelling evidence from multiple sources," she began. "I've examined documents whose authenticity has been verified by expert analysis. I have listened to testimony from families who have spent decades seeking answers about loved ones who simply vanished." She paused. "I have also heard troubling allegations about the defendant corporation's ongoing efforts to suppress historical evidence and silence potential witnesses. These allegations, if proven, represent a serious breach of legal and ethical obligations." Her gaze moved to the defense table where Harlan Briggs sat motionless. "Based on the evidence presented, I find sufficient cause to order a formal investigation into the historical operations of Piedmont Mining and its successor companies, including Ridgeline Resources. I am issuing an immediate freeze on any activities near the Whitmore property or other sites identified in the historical documentation pending the completion of this investigation." A murmur swept through the gallery. Judge Blackwood raised her hand for silence. "I'm also referring the matter of potential document destruction and witness intimidation to the State Attorney General for further inquiry. And I am recommending that a reparations fund be established for affected families pending full verification of the evidence presented here." She looked directly at the Ridgeline attorneys. "The defendant corporation will cooperate fully with all investigations. Any attempt to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, or otherwise obstruct justice will be met with the most severe sanctions this court can impose." Finally, she turned to Margot. "Miss Whitmore, I want to commend you for bringing this matter forward, despite significant personal risk. Your grandfather preserved evidence of terrible crimes at great cost to himself. By ensuring that evidence was finally heard, you have honored his memory and served the interests of justice." She gathered her papers. "This court is adjourned." The settlement negotiations took 3 weeks. Ridgeline's board of directors, facing the prospect of prolonged investigations, criminal referrals, and devastating publicity, decided to cut their losses. Adelaide handled most of the negotiations, but she kept Margot informed every step of the way. "They're offering a substantial payment to you as the current landowner," she reported during one late-night session. "Acknowledgement of the historical misuse of Whitmore property and compensation for the company's intimidation tactics." "What about the families?" "A reparations fund with an independent commission to evaluate claims and distribute compensation. It won't bring anyone back, but it's recognition, it's acknowledgement that what happened was wrong." "And the property, permanent conservation easement on the ridge, no mining, no development, no disturbance of any sites that might contain remains. The cabin will be preserved as a memorial and education center with community oversight to ensure the truth is presented honestly." Margot thought about her grandfather living alone on that mountain for decades, guarding secrets he could never share. "Including my grandfather's role, including everything, the good and the bad, they agreed that any historical account must be complete and accurate." It wasn't perfect justice. The men who had committed the original crimes had lived full lives and died peacefully. Some families would never recover remains or have all their questions answered. Harlan Briggs was quietly transferred to a division in another state, neither punished nor promoted but removed from the equation. But something fundamental had shifted. The conspiracy of silence had been broken. Names long unspoken were now being engraved on memorial stones. The missing were no longer simply missing. They were acknowledged victims whose stories finally mattered. 1 year later, the Whitmore property had transformed beyond recognition. The main house stood solid again, its roof restored, its walls insulated against the mountain winters, its windows gleaming in the morning sun. Smoke rose from the chimney carrying the scent of wood fire and something baking in the oven. Margot stood on the rebuilt porch, coffee mug warming her hands, watching the sun rise over the ridge. So much had changed in a year. The settlement money had been more than enough to restore the house and establish what she had come to think of as her grandfather's true legacy. Not the evidence of crimes, not the documentation of corporate evil, but something that grew from the ashes of all that pain. Whitmore Haven, the small retreat for homeless mothers and their children, had started as an idea, a way to transform her family's tragedy into something that could help others. Now it was becoming reality. Simple cabins were rising on the lower slope of the ridge, away from the historical sites, each one designed to house a family, to provide walls and warmth and safety for women who had known too much of cold and fear. A community kitchen was taking shape near the main house, a play area where children could run without watching over their shoulders, gardens where residents could grow food and learn skills that might help them build new lives. "Mom," June's voice carried from inside the house, "Mabel's here." Margot turned to see the familiar pickup truck making its way up the drive. Mabel had become family over the past year. She joined them for dinner most Sundays, shared stories about the old days, helped with the endless tasks involved in building something from nothing. Her own journey toward closure had been painful but necessary. The investigation had confirmed that her father, Harold Thornton, had been among those taken to the labor camps. His remains had never been found, but his name was now carved on the memorial stone that stood near the cabin. For the first time in her life, Mabel could visit her father's resting place. Even if it was symbolic, it mattered. "Beautiful morning," Mabel observed, climbing the porch steps with the ease of someone who had spent her life on mountain terrain. "It is." Margot handed her a cup of coffee. "The contractors say the first cabin should be ready by spring. 3 families already on the waiting list, I heard. 4 as of yesterday." Margot smiled. "Word is spreading. Social workers from 3 counties have been in touch. Apparently, there aren't many places that will take mothers and children together without separating them." "You're filling a need," Mabel said. "A big one." From inside the house came the sound of small feet running across wooden floors. A moment later, Silas burst through the door, his 4-year-old energy barely contained. "Aunt Mabel." He launched himself at the older woman, who caught him with practiced ease. "There's my favorite young man." Mabel swung him in a circle. "You've gotten so big since last week." "I'm helping Mom make pancakes," Silas announced proudly, "with blueberries." "Well, we'd better get inside before they burn." Margot watched them go, her heart full. Silas was thriving. His asthma had improved dramatically with the clean mountain air, the regular medication, the stability that had seemed impossible just a year ago. He rarely had attacks anymore, and when he did, they were mild. More importantly, he had stopped looking at every stranger with fear. He laughed easily now, trusted easily, was becoming the child he should have been all along. June appeared in the doorway. At 16, she had grown into someone Margot barely recognized from the hardened street kid of a year ago. The wariness was still there, probably always would be, but it had been tempered by something else. Purpose. The latest video hit 10,000 views, June reported, scrolling through her phone. People are really responding to Mrs. Beckett's story. June's documentation project had evolved into something neither of them had expected. What started as a way to preserve evidence had become a channel dedicated to telling the stories of the families affected by Piedmont's crimes. She interviewed survivors and descendants, documented the investigation as it unfolded, created a permanent record of voices that had been silenced for too long. College recruiters have been calling again, June added casually. Journalism programs, documentary film studies. And I told them I'm not leaving until the haven is established. She shrugged. Besides, there are still stories to tell. We've only scratched the surface. Margot felt tears prick her eyes. When had her daughter grown up so much? When had the angry girl who slept with a knife in her boot become this thoughtful young woman who understood that some things were more important than personal advancement? I'm proud of you, Margot said quietly. June smiled. I learned from the best. The memorial dedication was scheduled for late afternoon. People began arriving around 3 cars winding up the mountain road in a steady stream. Families who had received answers after decades of questions, community members who wanted to witness history, reporters who had covered the story and wanted to see its conclusion. The memorial itself was simple, a stone wall bearing the names of everyone who had been documented as victims of Piedmont's labor camps. Not all the names were confirmed, perhaps never would be, but the families had agreed that it was better to include everyone than to leave anyone forgotten. At the center of the wall stood a bronze plaque. In memory of those who were taken, their labor built fortunes, their lives were stolen, their stories were buried. But the truth endures. Dedicated by their families and by Margot Whitmore, who ensured their voices would finally be heard. The old radio from the cabin had been restored by a local enthusiast and installed in a small pavilion near the memorial. It played continuously now, a recording of the VE Day broadcast that announced the end of the war in Europe. The war that had been used as cover for so many crimes. The war that had ended but whose shadows had stretched across nearly 8 decades. Margot stood before the crowd, looking out at faces she had come to know over the past year. Ruth Pendleton, who had finally learned what happened to her uncle. Mrs. Beckett, 94 now, but still sharp, who had lived to see her father's questions answered. Mabel, who no longer had to wonder about the father she had never known. And so many others. Families reunited with their histories, children who finally understood why grandparents carried such weight, a community that had found the courage to look at its past honestly. A year ago, Margot began, I stood in an alley behind a diner trying to keep my children warm in the rain. I had nothing, no home, no money, no hope. She paused, letting the memory wash over her. Then I learned about this place, about my grandfather, about the secrets he had kept and the truth he had preserved. I came here with nothing but desperation, expecting nothing but disappointment. Her eyes found June in the crowd. What I found instead was a story that needed to be told, names that needed to be spoken, truths that had been buried for too long. She turned toward the memorial wall, toward the names carved in stone. These men didn't ask to be heroes. They didn't volunteer to be martyrs. They were ordinary people, fathers and sons and brothers, who went to work one day and never came home. Their families were told lies. Their names were erased from history. Their sacrifice was stolen from them. Her voice grew stronger. But the truth has a way of surviving. My grandfather understood that. Even when he was afraid, even when he was threatened, even when silence would have been so much easier, he preserved the evidence. He kept faith that someday someone would come who could do what he couldn't. Margot looked out at the crowd. I don't know if what we've done here is enough. No amount of money can bring back the dead. No memorial stone can fill the holes in a family. No justice, however delayed, can undo the injustice that was done. She straightened her shoulders. But we can remember. We can speak the names that were silenced. We can tell the stories that were buried, and we can make sure that what happened here is never forgotten. She gestured toward the cabins taking shape on the lower slope. The Whitmore Haven will be a place where families who have lost everything can find shelter and hope, where mothers don't have to choose between their children and a roof over their heads, where the legacy of this place can be transformed from tragedy into something that heals. Margot turned back to the memorial wall. To everyone whose name is carved here, I make this promise. Your story will be told, your sacrifice will be remembered, and from the ground that holds your remains, something good will grow. She stepped back and the crowd began to move forward, each person finding the names they had come to honor. Ruth touched her uncle's name with trembling fingers. Mabel stood before her father's inscription, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Beckett, supported by family members, placed her hand on her uncle's name and whispered something only she could hear. And the radio played on that tinny voice from 80 years ago, announcing the end of one war while commemorating the long-delayed resolution of another. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Margot and Mabel stood on the porch of the restored house. Snow was falling in soft flakes, dusting the ground with white. The lights of the cabins under construction glowed warmly in the gathering dusk, and on the ridge above the museum that had once been a sealed cabin was lit against the darkness a beacon for anyone who might be seeking their way. He carried that secret his whole life, Mabel said quietly. Your grandfather. It nearly crushed him. Margot nodded. You didn't just open a cabin, Margot. You opened a door that he couldn't, a door he'd been standing behind for 76 years, waiting for someone strong enough to break the seal. Margot thought about her grandfather, the man she had barely known, the man who had made terrible choices and spent his life trying to atone for them. The man who had preserved the truth because he believed against all evidence that truth still mattered. He couldn't open it himself, she said. The fear was too strong. The threats were too real. He did what he could, preserved what he could, and trusted that someday someone in his family would be desperate enough or brave enough to finish what he started. She looked up at the ridge at the cabin lights glowing through the falling snow. He left it for someone who had nothing left to lose. Mabel reached over and squeezed her hand. And you turned that nothing into something, into this. She gestured at the house, the cabins, the memorial visible in the distance. Into hope. The snow continued to fall. Inside the house, June was helping Silas with his homework, their voices carrying faintly through the windows. Adelaide had called earlier to report that the investigations were progressing, that more evidence was being uncovered, that the full scope of Piedmont's crimes might never be known, but would no longer be hidden. Somewhere out there, other families were still searching for answers. Other truths were still waiting to be told. Other doors were still sealed, waiting for someone brave enough to break them open. But that was tomorrow's work. Tonight, Margot stood on her grandfather's porch in her grandfather's house on her grandfather's land and felt something she had almost forgotten existed. Peace. The wind sighed through the pines, carrying whispers of all those who had walked this ridge before. Some by choice, some by force, some seeking their fortunes, some seeking only to survive. And now, finally, some of them could rest. The radio in the distant museum played its endless loop, that voice from the past announcing the end of a war that had shaped everything that followed. But on the Whitmore property, a different kind of peace had been declared, not the peace of silence and forgetting, the peace of truth finally spoken, the peace of wrongs finally acknowledged, the peace of a story complicated and painful and ultimately redemptive finally told. Margot watched the snow fall on the mountains, on the memorial, on the ground that held so many secrets and so much sorrow. And she thought about what she would tell the first families who came to Whitmore Haven. The mothers with nothing, the children with everything to fear the desperate and the lost and the forgotten. She would tell them what she had learned in that alley behind Eddie's diner, what she had discovered in her grandfather's sealed cabin, what she had proven in a courtroom where the powerful had finally been held to account. The truth is worth more than fear, and sometimes having nothing left to lose is exactly what you need to find your voice.